Hi everyone, so today we're discussing contextualism, and contextualism is a theory about language, about how words get their meaning. In this case, it's contextualism in epistemology, so applied to epistemic concepts, and especially the concept of know. So I made a PowerPoint for you today to make this a little bit more interesting to watch, and let's get started. Right, so this right here is Jason Stanley. He's the one who's written this article that we're reading, which is called On the Linguistic Basis for Contextualism. And he's actually going to spend most of this paper critiquing approaches to contextualism. And his critiques are going to be based in principles in linguistics and principles in the philosophy of language. So he's going to be saying that maybe contextualism has a bad basis. But before we get into that, what is contextualism as a view? What does it say? Contextualism, says Stanley, is, quote, the doctrine that the proposition expressed by a knowledge attribution relative to a context is determined in part by the standards of justification salient in that context. So basically what it's saying is that whether or not someone has knowledge, according to a contextualist, will vary depending on the standards that are at play in the conversational context. So the non-skeptical contextualist allows that in some contexts, call them context A or something, a speaker may truly attribute knowledge of a proposition P to someone, say Hannah, despite her possession of only weak inductive evidence for the truth of proposition P. Relative to another context, someone may make the very same knowledge attribution to Hannah and yet be speaking falsely because the epistemic standards in that context are higher. And I'll give you another more helpful example in a minute. But first, let me say that the reason that this is possible, that context can change whether or not someone truly knows, according to the contextualist, is because the two knowledge attributions express different propositions on their view. So in the two contexts, even though I'm saying the same sentence, it's actually expressing a different proposition. So if I say Hannah knows that P in one context, I'm expressing, like, say, the proposition A, but if I say Hannah knows that P in a different context with different conversational standards, I'm actually expressing a different proposition. And that's what makes that same looking sentence actually have a different truth value, because it's actually expressing different propositions. So I'll give you an example. Suppose we've got a peon and a king, and the peon here is pointing to a river and making a statement, look, my liege, salmon. Now suppose that we're in a conversational context where the king wants to eat. He wants to know whether there are salmon in the river because he would like to know if he's going to find something to eat. So does the peon know that there are salmon in this case? We usually think that, yeah, why not? He's seen the salmon, he's pointed at the salmon, the king wants to eat, they're good fish for eating, so the peon knows for this context that there's salmon. So the king says, yeah, the peon knows he has salmon. Now let's think of a different context. Same general situation, but conversationally other things are going on. Same thing, peon says, look, my liege, there are salmon. But the king now wants to study salmon. He's a scientist king. And in this context, does his peon know that there are salmon? We can imagine the king saying, I won't be happy, peon, if those are not salmon, but instead they're carp. So you better be sure that you say that there are salmon. So maybe he does know, maybe he doesn't know, but the idea that the contextualist has is that the standards that we establish in that conversation are the things that determine whether it's true to say that the peon knows. So it could be that the peon does know in context one, but doesn't know in context two. That's a possibility. It could also be the case that the peon does know in context one and the peon does know in context two because his evidence is good enough, even in context two. But now let's imagine a third scenario. And this is the one that in the beginning kind of got contextualists going, you could think. Suppose that the king here wants to do philosophy. Suppose we've got a philosopher king. And the peon says the same thing. Look, my liege, salmon. Does his peon know that there are salmon? Well, the king is interested in a Cartesian skeptical argument, and he's thinking about that now. And so when the peon says, look, there are salmon, the king asks him, how do you know you're not dreaming? How are you so sure there are salmon there? And not that you're just imagining them, not that you're just dreaming of salmon. So in this conversational context, says the contextualist, the standards are so high that actually the knowledge attribution we were given to the peon earlier doesn't seem true in this context. For this context, the peon doesn't know that there are salmon. And this is even though we're saying the same thing. And like the circumstances are relevantly similar. The main difference is what's happening linguistically, what's happening in the conversation. The standards for the purposes of the conversation are different in these three cases. And so for the contextualist, that's what explains why we feel confident in attributing knowledge in some cases and not in others, because we are attributing knowledge relative to a standard. So here's a quote from Stanley. It is because knowledge attributions are context sensitive that we are fooled by skeptics into thinking that even in non-skeptical circumstances, many of our knowledge attributions are false. But the contextualist thinks it's only in these cases where we're already kind of taking a salient to our standard that we might be in a skeptical scenario that our knowledge is defeated. In the other kind of context, where it's a normal case, we're not doing philosophy, we do know. And the conversational context allows that that's a true attribution of knowledge. So the explanation of all this phenomenon is that according to the contextualist, the word know is an indexical expression. Relative to different contexts of use, it expresses different relations between persons and propositions. An example of an indexical is the word I. I changes its meaning depending on who says it. If I say I, it means me, Sophia Ortiz. If, my fiance Brad uses it and he says I, he means Brad. So the indexical is expressing a different relationship depending on who uses it. That's what the contextualist thinks about no. Depending on what context it's being used in, it means something slightly different. So here's an application. Look, my leaves salmon is the same sentence applied in the first context where the king wants to eat, and compared to the standard, which is kind of a low standard, it's an easy standard to meet. The knowledge attribution will depend on whether, whatever is in the river is edible. Then we do get a knowledge attribution that is true. It feels like the peon knows. We're all good. Now think about the second context, where we have a medium standard because the king wants to study salmon. So the standard is a little higher than just any old fish will do. In this case, only salmon will do. And you've got to be sure that you can distinguish salmon from non-salmon, for example. So knowledge attribution will depend on whether the peon can differentiate salmon. So does the peon know? Well, it depends on how good his evidence is, right? And now think of the third context. The king wants to do philosophy. Same statements. But the standard now is high. Knowledge attribution will depend on meeting skeptical standards, which are, as we remember, quite high. So in this case, we think in most scenarios, the peon will fail to meet the standards and he won't know that there are salmon, even though in the previous contexts, he did know there are salmon, right? So that's what the contextualist likes. The contextualist thinks that it solves puzzles with groups of statements like these. 1, I know that I have hands. 2, but I don't know that I have hands if I don't know that I'm not a brain in a vat. 3, I don't know that I'm not a brain in a vat. We like to say that all 3 of those statements sound true to us, and other accounts can't explain it. Other accounts have to say that one of those 3 statements is false. The contextualist can allow that they're all true because the standards change depending on what sentence you're looking at. So the I know that I have hands statement is true relative to a non-skeptical standard. And so knowledge attributions will be fine. And the second and the third one are relevant to a different conversational context. And that's how we get around all 3 are true, even though it feels like it's an inconsistent use of the word knowledge, right? So one of the bits of evidence that contextualists cite for why to be a contextualist, besides how convenient it is toward figuring out why we assert skeptical stuff in skeptical scenarios, but not in non-skeptical scenarios, is that no is a gradable word. Tall, for example, is gradable in that tall is relative to the group of things that you happen to be talking about that are salient in the conversational context. So the 6 foot tall basketball player is tall relative to a context of, you know, how tall people are in general, but the 6 foot basketball player is not tall relative to the Statue of Liberty, right? So context changes what things tall applies to properly, right? What is a felicitous use of the word tall? And that's supposed to be the same thing as for the word no. So this is where Stanley comes in. Stanley says, but no, the word fails tests for gradable adjectives. So he's going to point out a few different kinds of discrepancies between things that we know are gradable words and the word no. This is our first example. Taking a modifier or becoming comparative is possible for gradable adjectives. So for example, you can say something is very tall, or you can compare a tall thing to another thing by saying it's taller than the other thing. And you can't do that with no's, thinks Stanley. One reply is to say, well, what about really no's? You know, you can't say very no's and you can't say knower than or something, but well, what about really knows? So someone really, really knows this idea, or someone really, really understands this thing better than someone else, for example. Stanley thinks that this fails a second test. We can say something is tall but not very tall, but we can't say someone knows but doesn't really know. The second one sounds like a contradiction. The first one doesn't. And so that indicates that there's a discrepancy between the gradable adjective tall and the word no. Also, there's a second reply that the contextualists try, which is, you know, what about the expression knows better than, right? You can use that. That sounds comparative. Stanley replies that those expressions, knows better than, seem to describe acquaintance knowledge. So we use them for things like Mary knows John. Mary knows John better, for example. But that's a relationship between two people and how well they're acquainted, not a relationship between a person and a proposition. Like suppose we were to say, Mary knows that roses are red, right? You can't use knows better than for expressions like that are propositions. So here's an example of that. Mary knows better than Sally that John likes roses. That's a weird sentence. What would it mean for Mary to know better than Sally that John likes roses? It's not completely infelicitous, but it doesn't sound great to our English-speaking ear. It seems to maybe have an implication that Mary is better acquainted than Sally with the fact that John likes roses, but what would that be, to be better acquainted with the fact? We don't like it so much, says Stanley. Here's a third reply that the contextualist tries. What about the expression knows very well? That seems graded because there's an emphatic word there, knows very well. Stanley thinks that that might be more of a pragmatic indicator than a gradation. What he says by way of explanation of this is that knows very well seems to be kind of like underlining knows, like he knows, you know, like he knows very well, like knows deeply or something like that. The evidence is that they can't be negated, though, unlike other kinds of pragmatic indicators. And also, Stanley says, they do poorly outside of assertions, which also pragmatic indicators don't have trouble with. Consider the sentence, I don't know very well that John likes roses. That sounds weird. What does it mean, I don't know very well that John likes roses? That proposition doesn't feel normal there. It would feel better to replace that John likes roses with an acquaintance relation. I don't know Mary very well, for example. That sounds fine, but I don't know very well that John likes roses. Sounds bad. If you were to place it, though, with a different kind of gradable adjective, like, I think that John is very tall. I don't think that John is very tall. Then it sounds fine. Also, in assertions, that the very well construction might sound okay, but outside of assertions, it sounds weird. For example, do you know very well that John likes roses? That sounds odd. Again, we could say, do you know Mary very well? And that would be fine. But do you know very well that John likes roses? Doesn't sound so great. So here's a fourth attempted reply to try to show that no is gradable, like the word tall. What about well-known? What about a fact being well-known? That seems graded, right? Because there's the word well there. And Stanley says, well, most uses of that sound like what they mean is widely known instead. So if I say the fact that roses are red is well known, it seems like what I mean is that lots of people know it, not that a specific person knows it kind of more than another person, right? So the fact that roses are red is well known by Mary, but not by John, sounds a little odd, right? Because what is that supposed to indicate? It starts to sound a little bit like these previous assertions that we had. I don't know very well that John likes roses. It's not very well known that John likes roses sounds fine, but when you compare who knows it well, that sounds odd. The fact that John likes roses is well known by Mary, but not by Bob. Weird. And notice, this is just an aside, a lot of these arguments have to do with linguistic intuitions, and these fuzzy cases are odd because they're syntactically okay, but something about the meaning of the sentence is confusing. And the test is whether English speakers like these constructions in English, and that's how we're supposed to find out what the word no really means and how the word no is really functioning in a sentence on the basis of how actual users of the language employ it. But of course, there's a certain amount of intuition here. I suppose there would be a way of making sense of weird sentences like this making sense, but it's going to be an uphill battle for the contextualist. So here's a final reply. What about in embedded questions like John knows how to swim well, or Mary knows how to ride a bike better than John does? Those seem like refined cases of comparatives. Stanley says, yeah, that's better. John knows how to swim well. Mary knows how to ride a bike better. But he says, this seems like it's measuring the adequacy of the agent's answers to questions about what they know, rather than the gradability of knowledge. So Stanley thinks this is a case where John knows how to swim well means that if you ask John, how do you swim, he'd give us a good answer. Or that if we asked Mary, do you know how to ride a bike, she'd give a better answer than John would give. And Stanley thinks that's what's explaining it. Now, I'm going to say, as someone reading this, I think Stanley's answer here is lukewarm. It's not his best response to an attempt by the contextualist to make sense of the gradability of knowledge. I think that these are good examples of gradability. Maybe what they show, though, is that these good answers apply better to skills or abilities than they do outside of that to purely propositional stuff. Like knows how to is a different expression than knows that. And it seems clear that knows that doesn't like the gradable features as much as maybe knows how. But that's still kind of fuzzy evidence for the contextualist. So Stanley's still winning a little bit. Stanley concludes at the end of this particular part of his argument that the burden of proof is still on the contextualist, which sounds right. Maybe contextualism is true, but they need to provide better evidence for why no is supposed to be a gradable word, like tall. There's just not good enough evidence yet. We need more robust examples. We need an analysis that explains why we get cases like these. So a second argument for contextualism goes like this. It says the descriptions of justification are graded and context sensitive, and therefore so are ascriptions of knowledge. Here's an example. Premise 1, gradable expressions are context sensitive. Premise 2, so we can expect the gradable term justified to be context sensitive. Premise 3, S knows P means in part what is meant by, quote, P is justified for S, unquote. Conclusion, so the truth of S knows P depends upon context. So Cohen's argument here is saying that because justification is kind of a part of knowledge, and we all agree that justification seems more context sensitive and more graded, that if justification is context sensitive and graded, then knowledge and knowledge ascriptions in particular will also be graded and context sensitive. So like basically the idea is if a part of the analysis of a concept is graded and context sensitive, then probably some part of that built up concept is also going to be graded and context sensitive. So because justification is graded, so will knowledge be. Stanley again has some counter arguments to this argument. So first of all, he says, there's a problem with premise 1, the idea that gradable expressions are context sensitive. Stanley shows, I think, that gradability and context sensitivity can come apart. For example, consider the sentence, John is taller than 6 feet. It's a gradable word here, taller than. You can say something is very much taller, but John is taller than 6 feet. That sentence is not context sensitive. There are no other contexts in which it will come out true or false. It's just as a fully formed comparative, it's not going to be context sensitive, even though it's making use of a gradable concept. So that shows that just because something is gradable doesn't mean that it's context sensitive. Stanley also says that there's a problem with premise 3, that S knows that P means in part what is meant by P is justified for S, so that the meaning of knows depends on the meaning of justification. Stanley says here that you can analyze, for example, the word vacuum as meaning something like mostly empty. But the fact that vacuum can be analyzed as mostly empty doesn't mean that the word vacuum is context sensitive just because empty is context sensitive. Vacuum is not context sensitive, even though empty is, right? Whether something is empty depends on what you're comparing it to, but whether something is a vacuum doesn't depend at all on what you're comparing it to. In a sense, vacuum is an absolute concept. What if knows is like that? What if knows is absolute, even though justified is graded or context sensitive? Then we'll have a challenge for premise 3. Another way to try to make sense of contextualism is to ask in general, how does context sensitivity usually work? According to the discourse model, which is the one that Stanley thinks that this contextualist is using, it is via conversational standards. So context sensitivity depends on what it is that we're talking about before. That's the discourse model. But Stanley says that that's not how other context sensitive terms work. So suppose you want to adopt the discourse model for knowledge, it might be a problem because you can't adopt the discourse model for these other context sensitive terms. For example, usually context shifting can occur within sentences for other words that are context sensitive, but it doesn't work for the word no. Consider the sentence, if you have a car, then Detroit is nearby. But if you don't have a car, then Detroit is not nearby. That sounds fine, right? You have an instance of nearby that is negated later. Detroit is nearby, Detroit is not nearby, happens within the same sentence. And the conditional statement changes the scope of application for that word, and that shifts the context, and it can happen within a sentence. And that's fine for the word nearby, but now compare it to the word no. Try the sentence, if you have hands, then you know that you have hands. But if you have hands and you're an epistemologist, you don't know you have hands. That sounds a little weird because within the same sentence, you're getting the phrase, you know you have hands and you don't know you have hands. And that sounds odd. And Stanley suggests that that sounds off because no is not capable of context shifting within a sentence. And that would make it a strange kind of context sensitive. if the contextualist analysis of knowledge is supposed to be correct, this is a problem for it, basically. So either context sensitivity varies depending on the words that we're using, or no is just not context sensitive. Here's another final way of trying to account for contextualism. This final way talks about the concept of ambiguity and loose use. What if no is a word that's applied loosely or ambiguously? And that's what explains why it works in some contexts and not in others. Compare no now to phrases like "it is 3 o'clock," which are usually thought to be true when uttered even if it's 3:03 and not 3 o'clock. The expression "it's 3 o'clock" is loose or ambiguous, so it can be true even though it's not strictly true. Also consider a case where, suppose that Mary is the best trained medical practitioner in a particular village, even though she doesn't have an MD, you know, she can be referred to as the doctor in the village, even if strictly she's not a licensed doctor, right? That can be true to say of her because it's a loose use of language. It's approximately true, and so it's fine. Now, does that analysis work for knowledge? Would that analogy work? Stanley says, again, no. There's two options. There's two ways that no could be ambiguous or loose. One way is that it could be literally false, but pragmatically felicitous. So literally, it's false to say, for example, that it's 3 o'clock when it's 3:03. But it's felicitous anyway for pragmatic reasons, that it's just as good as saying it's 3:03. Why can't we say that about knowledge? Stanley says that this position is basically skepticism. Regular attributions of knowledge are going to count as generally false. So it's like, you know, at any one time, what is specifically and literally true is different from what we're saying everybody knows. That's just the skeptical position, says Stanley. The skeptic also thinks that usually we use this word knowledge, but we're not using it accurately. We're using it that way for purely pragmatic reasons, and that means that it's literally false. So if we started out adopting contextualism as a way to avoid skepticism, this isn't going to be the way to do it. Another way that no could be ambiguous or loose is if it was actually literally true, and it was applied, but it was also applied loosely or ambiguously in another sense. And Stanley's response to this is a little bit complicated. In a way, you could consider that he's asking, if it's literally true, then why call it loose use of the word no? If it's literally true, that doesn't sound loose at all. And then why use the analogy to looseness? And suppose that even if you like you didn't care about that, even if you wanted to use the sense of loose or ambiguous, saying every use of no is like the permissible use of "it is 3 o'clock" when it is 3:03 is not very satisfying, says Stanley, because it's just kind of an approximation. It's a literally true somehow approximation, but it's not very satisfying. It seems to have little advantage over skepticism. You might think that the second answer doesn't do much better than the first one. So that can't be the explanation of why knowledge is context variant, that it's an ambiguous or loosely applied word. So that's perhaps the least good of the options. So we've tried out roughly 3 options. We've tried the idea that knowledge is graded. We've tried the idea that knowledge is context sensitive. And we've tried now the idea that maybe knowledge is ambiguously or loosely applied. Stanley has given us reasons why we should be wary of all 3 of those things. Oh, and we've also heard a 4th one, which is that maybe knowledge is graded or context sensitive because justification is. Stanley has also given us reasons to doubt that reasoning for why knowledge is graded or context sensitive. Stanley's preferred view, which he doesn't go over in the paper, and which we might talk a little bit about in class if there's time, if you're interested in it, really. His preferred view is that knowledge attributions change over time according to the knower's interests. So he kind of agrees with the contextualists that knowledge attributions change, and are true at different times, but he doesn't think it's because it changes with context. He thinks that it changes depending on what the interests of the knowers are. He says it's not contextualism because it doesn't depend on the interests of the knowledge attributor. It doesn't depend on the conversational context. It depends on what is influencing the knowledge claim, something like that. What's influencing the thing the knower is interested in doing, in achieving. So you can have something like an answer to skepticism that makes sense of, let me pull it up, that makes sense of this, according to Stanley, if you relativize it to the speaker's interests. But he thinks that's not a case of contextualism. That looks a little bit like taking seriously the claims made by William James, right? That it matters what problem I'm interested in solving. In a way, Stanley seems to be tacitly agreeing with that approach. Again, we won't have time now to cover the details of that view, but if you're interested in it, please bring it up and I'll do my best to give you a little primer on Stanley's non-contextualist, semi-contextualist view. That's all the time we have for today. Hopefully that helped you understand this paper a little bit better, and I'll see you soon. Bye.